What would you do if nothing could stop you? If every law, every voice, every consequence vanished? If you could take whatever you wanted, kill whomever you pleased, and be adored for it? What kind of person would you become? That question isn't a thought experiment, it's a historical reality, and few men answered it more clearly than Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, a name almost forgotten beneath the nickname history gave him, Caligula. Rome's third emperor, Caligula is remembered not for great wars or brilliant policy, but for something far more terrifying. A reign defined by cruelty, excess, and madness so spectacular that his name became a warning passed down through centuries. Even today, Caligula is a shorthand for the moment power rots the soul. You've probably heard the more outrageous stories. The emperor who made his horse a consul, who married his sister, who declared himself a living god. But beneath the legends lies a more disturbing truth. Not a lunatic clown, but a damaged man placed into absolute authority, whose descent into tyranny happened in plain sight. Because Caligula wasn't always a monster. He was once a quiet, watchful boy, born into one of Rome's most powerful dynasties. He survived political purges, the death of his parents, and exile under the same emperor who may have murdered his family. His childhood was a blueprint of trauma wrapped in luxury, and when power finally landed in his hands, the consequences were unlike anything the Roman world had seen. In the next few chapters, we'll go beyond the scandals and blood-soaked rumors. We'll trace how a favored child of Rome became its most feared ruler. We'll uncover the politics, the paranoia, and the psychological decay behind the stories. And by the end, you may see that Caligula wasn't just a tyrant. He was a mirror, reflecting what happens when power belongs to someone with nothing left to fear. Caligula was born into a dynasty already devouring itself. On August 31st, 12 AD, in the coastal town of Antium, the boy who would one day shake the Roman Empire was born into privilege so immense it seemed untouchable. His father was Germanicus, a beloved general, the golden boy of the empire, the kind of man crowds cheered in the streets. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, came from the bloodline of Augustus himself. The match wasn't just prestigious, it was political destiny. To understand how important this child was, imagine if every royal house in Europe, Windsor, Bourbon, Habsburg, merged into one family. That was Caligula's lineage. He wasn't just a prince, he was Rome's future, and Rome adored his father. Germanicus was brave, charismatic, and popular, everything the reigning emperor Tiberius was not. But popularity in imperial Rome was a dangerous thing. While young Caligula grew up marching alongside his father's legions on the German frontier, dressed in a miniature soldier's outfit, earning him the nickname Caligula, or Little Boot, the politics back in Rome were turning deadly. Tiberius had taken power reluctantly after the death of Augustus, but his grip on the throne was fragile. The public didn't love him, the Senate didn't trust him, and Germanicus, with his victories and charisma, looked a little too much like a successor. In 19 AD, everything changed. Tiberius recalled Germanicus to the east under vague pretenses. Within months, Germanicus was dead, supposedly from illness, but many suspected poisoning. His widow Agrippina was convinced the emperor had orchestrated it. She returned to Rome with her children in tow and began openly accusing the throne of murder. Tiberius responded with brutal efficiency. Agrippina was exiled to a remote island where she eventually starved to death. Her oldest son took his own life. Another was left to rot in prison. The once gilded family was torn apart in silence and scandal. Only Caligula survived, spared not by mercy but by strategy. The emperor allowed him to live, possibly to keep up appearances, or possibly because he saw value in keeping the boy under his control. Caligula spent his teenage years under a kind of gilded surveillance, raised by his great-grandmother, the formidable Livia, and then by his grandmother Antonia. He learned to stay quiet, to watch, to survive. By the time he was a teenager, Caligula had lost nearly everything: his father, his mother, his brothers, his security. He had learned that loyalty meant nothing in Rome, and that survival depended on silence. And when he was finally summoned to Capri to live with the emperor who may have murdered his family, the transformation began. By the time Caligula arrived on the island of Capri in his late teens, he had already mastered one essential skill: how to hide in plain sight. The villa that awaited him wasn't a summer retreat. It was a gilded prison filled with shadows. Emperor Tiberius had removed himself from Rome years earlier, ruling from his cliff-top compound in isolation. Officially, he had retreated for his health. Unofficially, he was ruling through fear, orchestrating purges and show trials from a distance, while cultivating a private world of depravity that would have scandalized even the Romans. Capri was a palace of whispered torment. There are tales, some exaggerated, some not, of children taken as playthings, public tortures staged for amusement, and executions ordered on a whim. Tiberius didn't just rule the empire, he played God with the lives of anyone unlucky enough to fall within his reach. Into this world stepped Gaius Caligula, a boy whose family had been annihilated by the man now hosting him. For most, this would have been a death sentence. But Caligula understood the game. He kept his mouth shut, his posture humble, his rage buried. He flattered Tiberius. He laughed at his jokes. When others were interrogated or humiliated, he watched quietly and remembered everything. According to Roman sources, Caligula did more than just endure the cruelty of Capri. He began to enjoy it. Tiberius, whether amused or impressed, gradually allowed his young ward deeper into his inner circle. He was permitted to witness, and allegedly participate in, the twisted entertainments that passed for court life on the island. Public floggings, forced orgies, arbitrary executions. In time, Tiberius supposedly allowed Caligula to arrange such scenes himself. One quote, attributed to the emperor, still echoes with chilling clarity. "I am nursing a viper for the Roman people." If true, it suggests Tiberius saw what was growing inside the boy, and left him to ripen anyway. It's hard to know how much of this is fact and how much myth. Ancient historians, writing long after Caligula's death, may have shaped these stories to fit the monster he later became. But even if half of it is true, the psychological impact is undeniable. This was a teenager who had seen his family destroyed by the empire, then been raised by its most ruthless tyrant. Capri didn't corrupt Caligula, it simply gave him permission. While other imperial heirs might have been taught to govern, Caligula was taught that people were disposable, that loyalty was a mask, that pleasure and pain were tools, to be used at will. And Tiberius, perhaps seeking a successor who shared his appetite for control, named Caligula co-heir alongside his own grandson Gemellus. But even then, Caligula was preparing for more than inheritance. He was already forging alliances in secret, most importantly with Naevius Sutorius Macro, commander of the Praetorian Guard, the man who controlled the emperor's personal army. If fate didn't deliver him power, Caligula intended to take it. And when Tiberius finally died, peacefully, suspiciously, or by force, Rome would discover what kind of man they'd just handed the world's greatest empire to. When Emperor Tiberius died on March 16th, 37 AD, few in Rome mourned. Whispers of joy spread like wildfire. The tyrant was gone. The long shadow he had cast over the empire had finally lifted. But who would take his place? Officially, Tiberius had named two heirs, his grandson Gemellus and his adopted son Caligula. But from the moment the emperor's breath stopped, the choice wasn't a matter of succession, it was a matter of force. Caligula had prepared for this moment. He had already secured the loyalty of Macro, head of the Praetorian Guard, Rome's most elite and politically decisive military force. And with their backing, the transition of power was swift and bloodless. Gemellus, the boy grandson of Tiberius, was placed under house arrest before he even understood what was happening. He would never again be free. His role in history would end not as a ruler, but as an inconvenient footnote. Caligula, now 24 years old, rode into Rome not like a new ruler, but like a returning hero. The city exploded in celebration. The Senate, which had lived under constant threat for 2 decades, greeted him like a savior. The people who had once adored Germanicus saw his son as a living echo of that beloved general. He was young, handsome, charismatic, and most importantly were not Tiberius. What came next was almost too good to be true. Caligula granted bonuses to the Praetorian Guard. He abolished the treason trials that had haunted Rome. He released political prisoners. He recalled exiles. He lowered taxes and restored stolen properties. He threw festivals, games, and feasts that turned the capital into one great stage of public joy. For a moment it seemed Rome had awoken from a nightmare into a new golden age, and Caligula basked in it. He was adored, worshipped, applauded by the same Senate that had once feared his grandfather. Even foreign envoys reported home that the young emperor might become one of the greatest rulers the empire had ever seen. But power is rarely content to remain benevolent. Beneath the smiles and acclamations, Caligula remained the same young man who had grown up watching executions on Capri, the boy who had learned to fake loyalty and bury pain, the one who had stood over a sleeping Tiberius at night, dagger in hand, and whispered that only the ghost of Augustus had stopped him from plunging it in. For now, Rome believed it had found its future, but the truth was darker. The emperor they had just crowned was still learning how to wear his mask. For the first few months of his reign, Caligula could do no wrong. He gave the people what they craved, not policy or reform, but relief. After years of dread under Tiberius, he offered laughter, games, generosity. Gladiator contests filled the amphitheatres. Grain was distributed freely. Temples were restored. Debts were forgiven. Even slaves were granted moments of clemency. To the Roman public, it was as if their prayers had been answered. The son of Germanicus had become emperor, and he was everything his father had promised to be: noble, generous, and kind. The Senate praised him. The crowds chanted his name. Foreign kings sent envoys bearing gifts. Rome, it seemed, had a new golden boy, a Caesar reborn in youth and glory. But behind the scenes, Caligula's confidence was building into something more volatile. Absolute adoration is its own kind of poison. With every cheer, every bowed head, every obedient senator groveling at his feet, Caligula began to believe what others had only whispered, that he was more than emperor. He was divine. And then, in October of 37 AD, the miracle emperor suddenly collapsed. No one is certain what struck him. Perhaps poison, perhaps an infection. But within days, he had fallen gravely ill. The palace was thrown into panic. Rome came to a standstill. Streets filled with anxious crowds waiting for updates. Senators offered sacrifices. Some, in their desperation to appear loyal, even pledged their own lives to the gods in exchange for Caligula's recovery. Miraculously, he survived. But when Caligula rose from his sickbed, something had changed. The smiling young ruler who had embraced the people was gone. In his place was someone colder, sharper, and more dangerous. A man convinced not just of his own greatness, but of his right to do anything he pleased. One of his first acts was to summon the senators who had offered their lives for his health. And then, with a calm smile, he asked them, "When are you planning to keep your promise?" Some nervously laughed. Others stayed silent. At least one was forced to follow through. Those around him began to whisper that the emperor had gone mad, or that something had crawled back with him from the edge of death. In public, Caligula still played the emperor, but his eyes were different now, less joyful, more calculating. His sense of humor turned cruel. His generosity became performance. He dressed in strange costumes. He joked about his power to kill anyone at any time for any reason. Rome had wanted a god. Now, it seemed, they had one. Caligula's return from illness marked the beginning of a reign no longer disguised by charm. The mask of the benevolent emperor cracked, and what lay beneath was raw, impulsive, and frightening. The young man who had once charmed the masses now openly mocked his advisors, humiliated senators, and terrorized the nobility. He paraded through the streets in costumes, sometimes as a general, other times as a god or even a woman. He ordered statues of himself placed in temples. He claimed to be Jupiter's equal, and in private moments his superior. He was no longer content to rule Rome. He wanted to be worshipped by it. Those in the Senate who had once toasted him now shifted uneasily in their togas. Caligula turned their hesitation into performance. He forced them to run beside his chariot for miles in the dust. At banquets, he would select a senator's wife, vanish with her into a side room and return smiling, often mocking the husband for his silence. And when these men bit their tongues, bowed their heads, and said nothing. Caligula laughed. He had proven his power, but not all his cruelty was aimed at the elite. He began plucking victims from every layer of society. One day, a drop of dirty water from an upstairs window landed on his head. His response? Order the home burned to the ground and everyone inside, including the servants, executed. When guards hesitated, he was told that someone inside was receiving last rites. That stayed his hand. Just barely. The old treason trials, those horrific showpieces of fear perfected by Tiberius, were brought back with even greater brutality. People were arrested for nothing more than a passing remark. Their wealth was seized, families were exiled, executions were public, drawn out and designed for spectacle. One day Caligula laughed during dinner. When asked what was so amusing, he answered, "I was thinking, with one word I could have all your throats cut." No one dared laugh. He executed Gemellus, his cousin and co-heir, accusing him of treason. He then turned on Macro, the very commander of the Praetorian Guard who had secured his rise to power. The man who had once stood at his side was dragged from court and killed without ceremony. And still the people cheered, or at least pretended to. Because in Caligula's Rome, survival meant smiling while you bled, pretending that the man parading through the forum in golden sandals wasn't spiraling further into delusion and violence, pretending the emperor was divine, because saying otherwise could get you and your entire family executed. The man who had once been a symbol of Rome's hope was now its greatest threat, and he was just getting started. By the year 38 AD, Caligula no longer saw himself as merely emperor. He believed, and demanded others believe, that he was a living god. He wasn't subtle about it either. Statues of Jupiter, Mars, and Apollo were ordered to be decapitated, their heads replaced with likenesses of Caligula himself. He began referring to himself by divine names, sometimes as Jupiter, sometimes as Neptune, even as Venus, depending on his mood or attire. In the eyes of Rome's elite, the emperor had lost his grip on reality, but in Caligula's mind, he had ascended beyond it. The temples of Rome were not spared. A directive went out across the empire. Statues of Caligula must be placed inside every holy site. In Judea, this order nearly ignited civil war. The idea of placing an idol in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem was considered blasphemy of the highest order. Had it not been for Herod Agrippa, a royal friend of Caligula's who delicately negotiated the temple's exemption, the uprising might have torn the eastern provinces apart. Back in Rome, Caligula now surrounded himself with gold, silk, and symbols of divinity. He slept in the temple of Castor and Pollux, dining where gods had once been honored. He had a bridge of ships constructed across the Bay of Baiae, a ridiculous, extravagant gesture meant to defy an old prophecy that said he had no more chance of ruling Rome than of riding a horse across the bay. So he rode a horse across the bay, and why not? By now, Caligula's actions weren't about governing. They were performance, elaborate declarations of his power over nature, religion, and death. One of his most famous insults to the Senate came during this period when he reportedly joked that his horse, Incitatus, was more competent than his ministers. Some sources claim he planned to make the animal a consul. Whether literal or symbolic, it was a stinging message. You are all beneath me. But his behavior wasn't limited to spectacle. He grew increasingly obsessed with his sister, Julia Drusilla. From childhood, they had been unusually close. Now, rumors spread that they were more than siblings, that she had become his lover, even his divine consort. He made the army swear loyalty oaths to her. When she died unexpectedly in June 38, he wept for days, had her deified, and demanded her worship as a goddess. Grief did not make him gentler, it hardened him. Caligula's remaining relationships became more dangerous, more transactional. He married and divorced women on whims. He slept with whomever he chose, often publicly, and dared anyone to object. His violence no longer needed justification. Executions happened not for treason or conspiracy, but for eye contact, bad omens, or a poorly timed yawn. Rome was no longer ruled by a man. It was ruled by a myth, written by Caligula, starring Caligula, and enforced by terror. By 39 AD, Rome was suffocating under the weight of its emperor's extravagance. Caligula's displays of power, his games, monuments, ships, and absurd public theatrics had drained the imperial coffers. What once seemed like a golden age of generosity had curdled into a financial crisis. And now, with no interest in restraint, the emperor looked to the only solution he trusted: fear. To refill the treasury, Caligula revived the hated treason trials, but this time there was no pretense of law. Innocent citizens, wealthy families, former allies, anyone with property could be accused, condemned, and executed. Their estates were seized, their heirs ruined, friends vanished without warning, and whispers in the forum became dangerous currency. The city that had once welcomed Caligula as a savior now cowered under his rule. Executions became more theatrical. Victims weren't just killed, they were tortured, made examples of. Some were drawn out over hours or days. Others were made to die in front of their own families. There were even reports of parents being forced to smile and applaud while their children were executed, too afraid to mourn. Anyone who showed discomfort could be next. His cruelty no longer served any strategic purpose. It had become a form of entertainment. Caligula relished his ability to control not just lives, but dignity, to reduce the proudest senators and generals into groveling cowards with a glance or a threat. His infamous comment at a banquet captures the tone of his reign. "I've just thought, I only have to give the word and all your throats will be cut." And no one doubted it. Those closest to him were not spared either. Caligula had long since turned on his former benefactor Macro, the man who helped him seize power. Macro was quietly executed, his loyalty forgotten. Caligula's cousin and co-heir Gemellus was forced to commit suicide. Even the Praetorian Guard, once his most dependable supporters, began to flinch. The emperor ruled through a balance of madness and manipulation. One moment he'd terrify the Senate with arbitrary killings. The next he'd host a grand festival or shower coins into the streets. He wanted the people to cheer through their terror, to celebrate his whims and convince themselves he was still the golden boy they once adored. But behind the noise, the truth was spreading. Rome was no longer governed by laws or legacy. It was ruled by a man who believed himself a god, a man who feasted on submission, a man who thought himself invincible. The empire wasn't just afraid of Caligula. It had been remade in his image, violent, unstable, and drunk on its own spectacle. And with money running out and paranoia mounting, Caligula set his sights beyond Rome. He would seek glory elsewhere, in the lands of Gaul, on the shores of Britain, even if the conquest existed only in his own mind. By late 39 AD, Caligula had grown restless. Rome no longer thrilled him the way it once had. He had crushed the Senate, exhausted his subjects, and buried the last of his rivals. The empire bent to his will, but it no longer excited him. He wanted conquest, applause from legions, a triumph not just of fear, but of Roman steel and glory. So, Caligula turned his eyes north, toward the frontiers of the empire. He announced plans to suppress unrest in Germania, then to invade the mysterious island of Britannia, which had not yet been brought under Rome's dominion. The idea wasn't just strategic, it was theatrical. He would return as a Caesar of legend, not just an emperor but a god of war. He brought with him an army said to number over 200,000 men, an enormous force, even by imperial standards. The Senate, ever submissive, offered their support. The provinces obeyed. Soldiers followed, uncertain but loyal. But as the campaign unfolded, it became clear that Caligula's war was not a war at all. According to ancient sources, he staged battles with troops disguised as German enemies, ordering fake skirmishes and rehearsed victories. Then he declared Germania pacified. When real German tribes struck at the empire's borders, Caligula reportedly panicked and fled, leaving others to handle the actual defense. But the true absurdity came when he turned toward the coast of Gaul, preparing to invade Britain. Here, in one of the strangest episodes of his reign, Caligula gathered his legions by the sea. He ordered them into formation. They waited for instructions. And then, he told them to collect seashells. Yes, seashells. He announced that they were spoils of victory against Neptune, god of the sea. In his mind, or at least in the story he told, he had conquered the ocean itself. The soldiers were stunned. Some laughed nervously, others dared not speak. The seashells were gathered, bagged, and carried back to Rome as trophies of a battle that had never occurred. To Caligula, it was a demonstration of power beyond war, the ability to rewrite reality itself. But to his commanders, and to the Senate back home, it was something else. Proof that the emperor had lost his mind. When he returned to Rome, it was not to fanfare, but whispers. The conquest of Britain had not happened. The German threat still loomed, and his so-called victory over the sea had cost the empire a staggering fortune. Grain shortages were growing. The treasury was again nearly empty. Even the loyal Praetorian Guard, once his fiercest protectors, were uneasy. Caligula's theatrics had once been a tool of intimidation. Now they were simply embarrassing. But the emperor didn't see it. He returned from Gaul not humbled, but emboldened, more convinced than ever that he alone held power over gods and men. What he couldn't see was that Rome had already begun to look for his replacement. By early 41 AD, Caligula had ruled for just under 4 years. 4 years of fear, humiliation, extravagance, and spectacle. And yet, to many in Rome, it felt like a lifetime. Behind the palace walls, those closest to him were whispering. Senators, who had once bowed in terror, were plotting. Praetorian officers, once his enforcers, now quietly questioned his every move. Even within the imperial family, trust had decayed. The spark came from an unlikely figure, Cassius Chaerea, a veteran officer of the Praetorian Guard. Caligula had mocked him repeatedly, calling him weak, effeminate, even nicknaming him after a woman. For a man raised in the harsh world of Roman honor, the insults were not just cruel, they were unforgivable. Others shared his rage. Caligula had turned his empire into a stage for madness and degradation, and few believed they could survive it much longer. The plan was simple: wait for the emperor to let his guard down, then strike. On January 24th, 41 AD, Caligula arrived at the Palatine Games. It was meant to be a day of celebration. He moved through a corridor beneath the theatre, surrounded by only a handful of guards and attendants. There, in that shadowed passageway, the conspirators struck. Cassius Chaerea led the charge, plunging a blade into the emperor's body. Caligula screamed, tried to flee, but others closed in. The emperor, who had ruled by fear, who claimed to be a god, died in the dirt, stabbed dozens of times by men who had once saluted him. His body was hidden quickly, but the conspirators knew their work wasn't done. To truly end Caligula's reign, they had to wipe out his bloodline. His wife, Milonia Cisonia, and their infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, were found and killed without hesitation. The Senate seized the moment. They debated restoring the Republic. No more emperors, no more tyranny. Rome, they believed, could rule itself again. But they underestimated the one force that had carried Caligula to power: the Praetorian Guard. Rather than dismantling the imperial system, the Guard marched to the imperial palace and declared a new emperor, Caligula's uncle, the nervous, stammering Claudius. He was crowned not because he was brilliant or popular, but because he was there, and they needed someone. Rome would have another emperor, and then another, and another still. Caligula was gone. His statues destroyed, his name erased, his memory condemned. But his lesson remained: that power, when left unchecked, doesn't just corrupt. It consumes, and once it has, it leaves behind not a legacy, but a warning.